I walked into the bank to reactivate an account I'd nearly forgotten I owned, one that held maybe $300 from a Christmas club I'd started years ago and never closed out. The branch manager looked at his screen, looked at me, and then said the words that split my life into a before and an after. "Ma'am, we've been looking for you. Welcome to Kate's Fortune Stories. It's Kate again, and I'm so happy you're here with me. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe, because this story is only just beginning. My name is Eleanor Doyle, though everyone who knows me calls me Ellie, and before any of this happened, I would have told you my life ran on a very small, very steady engine. I was 57 years old, living in a modest brick colonial on Idlewood Court in the Bon Air neighborhood outside Richmond, Virginia, the kind of street where the mail carrier knows your dog's name before she knows yours. I had worked as a pharmacist for 22 years at the same regional pharmacy chain, first behind the counter and eventually managing the store. I drove a 12-year-old Subaru Outback. I went to the farmer's market every Saturday morning without fail. I was not a woman who expected surprises, and for most of my life, that had suited me fine. My husband, Thomas Doyle, had died 9 months before that Wednesday. It happened in his sleep, a rare cardiac arrhythmia the doctors said afterward, quiet and merciless. I woke up beside him that morning and thought he was simply sleeping in. We had been married 23 years. I won't tell you every one of those years was effortless, because no marriage that long ever is, but I loved him the way you love the floor beneath your feet. You don't think about it until it's gone, and then you realize how much of your balance depended on it being solid. After he died, I moved through grief in the lopsided way most people do, fine for stretches, and then flattened without warning by something as small as a coffee mug still in the cabinet with his initials on it. That Wednesday morning, I drove to the Colonial Trust branch on Forest Hill Avenue with a small, tidy errand in mind. Years earlier, Thomas and I had opened a Christmas club savings account, the old-fashioned kind where you deposit a little every month and pull it out in December. We'd stopped using it around the time our son left for college, and it had just sat there, quietly accumulating pocket change. I wanted to close it out and finally stop the automatic transfer that still pulled $25 from our checking account every month. The teller who helped me was a young man named Dominic, maybe 26, with the kind of professional courtesy that comes from training, not temperament. I gave him the account number. He typed it in, and I watched something shift in his face, a stiffening around the eyes, a glance up at me, and then quickly back down at his screen. He asked me to wait one moment, then picked up a phone at his station and spoke quietly into it, his eyes flicking toward me twice. That was the part that unsettled me before anything else did. Tellers don't usually make phone calls about Christmas club accounts. A woman came out from the back within a few minutes, introduced herself as the assistant manager, and asked if I could step into an office. I wasn't alarmed yet. I assumed some kind of compliance flag, maybe something related to Thomas being deceased that needed a fresh set of paperwork. These things happen with old joint accounts. I followed her back to a small office with the branch manager already seated inside. His name was Mr. Bennett, 50-ish, with the deliberate calm of someone who spends a good part of his week delivering news people don't want. He shook my hand and thanked me for coming in, which struck me as an odd thing to say, since I hadn't been summoned. I'd simply walked in off the street to close a dusty little account. He asked me to sit, and then he said it. "Ma'am, we've been looking for you." I asked him what he meant. He explained, choosing his words with visible care, that the account I'd come in to close was not the only account under my name and Thomas's at that branch. There was a second account, opened 4 years earlier, that had been flagged internally for unusual activity and, more recently, for a compliance review tied to a large incoming wire that had triggered federal reporting requirements. The bank had sent letters to our home address, he said, and had attempted phone calls, but the number on file was an old landline we'd disconnected 2 years before Thomas died. They had been trying, through the proper channels, to reach the account holder for nearly 5 months. I told him I had no idea what account he was talking about. He turned his monitor toward me. $34,682,915.63. I stared at that number the way you stare at something written in a language you don't speak, waiting for it to resolve into sense. It didn't. $34 million, sitting in an account I had never once seen a statement for, never signed a deposit slip toward, never so much as heard mentioned across the kitchen table in 23 years of marriage. "You didn't know this account existed," Mr. Bennet said. It wasn't really a question. I told him no. My voice came out thinner than I expected. He nodded slowly, the way people do when they've delivered this kind of news before and know there's no gentle way through it. He explained that he wasn't able to discuss the source of the funds without further documentation, that the account had seen substantial deposit activity over the past 4 years, and that given the size of the balance and the nature of the compliance flag, the bank's fraud and compliance division would need a formal review before any transaction could proceed. He told me, gently, that I might want to speak with an attorney sooner rather than later. I drove home without really registering the drive. I sat in my driveway for a long time before I could make myself go inside. The house was exactly as I'd left it that morning. Thomas's reading glasses were still folded on his nightstand because I hadn't been able to move them yet. Everything the same, and nothing the same at all. I am not, by nature, a suspicious person. I had trusted Thomas without reservation for 23 years. But sitting in my kitchen that afternoon, I found myself doing something I had never let myself do before, walking back through small moments I'd never thought to question. The site visits to the port in Norfolk that sometimes stretched into 2-night trips. The second laptop I'd found once in the trunk of his car, which he said belonged to a client, and he was just holding on to it. The way he'd sometimes step out onto the back porch to take calls, even in January. Had I simply trusted him, or had I quietly decided, somewhere along the way, not to look too closely? And underneath all of it sat the question that frightened me most. If there was $34 million in an account with my name on it, whose money was it really, and who out there already knew it existed? I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark listening to the house settle and pulling gently on threads I had spent years leaving alone. Thomas had run his own small firm, Doyle Logistics Consulting, advising regional shipping and freight companies on cargo routing and insurance claims. That was the version he gave at dinner parties, and it was true as far as it went. I had met a few of his clients over the years at company holiday parties, watched him leave for the port with his laptop bag and a travel mug of coffee. Our income had always been comfortable, never extravagant. We took one real vacation a year, usually the Outer Banks. We had a modest retirement account and a mortgage we'd paid off 2 years before he died. Nothing about our life together had ever hinted at anything close to $34 million. So where had it come from? By 3 a.m, I was back at the kitchen table with my laptop, a legal pad, and the fireproof lockbox we kept in the hall closet. I had gone through that box after Thomas died to settle the estate, life insurance, the retirement account, the mortgage payoff letter, some old tax returns. I had never seen any mention of a second savings account, not once in any of it. I logged into the bank's online portal using the credentials Mr. Bennet's office had helped me set up that afternoon. The account was there. The balance was there. $34,682,000, glowing on my laptop screen in the middle of my ordinary kitchen at 3 a.m. I clicked into the transaction history. The deposits stretched back 4 years, large and irregular, $500,000 here, $1.3 million there, all originating from a single entity listed only as Blue Water Cargo Partners. I had never heard that name in 23 years of marriage. The transfers only ever moved in one direction until the final year of Thomas's life, when 2 withdrawals appeared. One for $900,000, one for $1.4 million. Both sent to an account number I didn't recognize. My hands had gone cold. I thought about calling my son, Caleb, who lived in Austin, but Caleb had idolized his father, and I wasn't ready to hand him something I couldn't take back. I thought about calling my sister, but she couldn't keep a secret through a single phone call, and whatever this was, it needed to stay quiet until I understood it myself. What I needed was a lawyer, and not the one who had handled Thomas's estate after he died, because that attorney had been Thomas's choice, someone he'd used for years, and suddenly that felt like it mattered. I needed someone who belonged entirely to me. I also needed to understand exactly what Blue Water Cargo Partners was. The next morning I called in sick to the pharmacy for the first time in nearly 4 years, and instead of opening my laptop at home, I drove to the downtown branch of the Richmond Public Library. Call it instinct, call it the beginning of caution. I didn't want to search any of this from our home network. Blue Water Cargo Partners turned out to be a Delaware-registered LLC. Beyond the basic filing, there was almost nothing public, no website, no press mentions, a registered agent's office in Dover that meant almost nothing on its own. I printed everything the library database would give me and spread it across a study Corel table like evidence in a case I hadn't yet admitted I was building. But the name listed as the managing member stopped my breath entirely. Nathaniel Cole. I knew that name. Nathaniel Cole had been Thomas's roommate at Old Dominion University, the best man at our wedding, a constant presence at every holiday gathering for the first decade of our marriage, until a falling out I never fully understood had quietly pulled him out of our lives almost 12 years ago. Thomas had told me, back then, that Nathaniel had gotten involved in some questionable freight brokering deals and that he'd had to distance himself for the sake of his own reputation. I had accepted that explanation the way I accepted most of Thomas's explanations, without pressing. Now I sat in a library corral in downtown Richmond thinking about Nathaniel Cole, $34 million, and 2 unexplained withdrawals made in the final year of my husband's life. And I made a decision. I was going to find out everything, quietly, carefully, and entirely within the law. I was not going to touch that account. I was not going to tell a single soul what I knew until I understood far more than I currently did. And I was going to find myself a sharp, good attorney, someone who handled financial fraud and estate disputes, before I took one visible step in any direction. Was I afraid? Yes. My pulse hadn't settled since that office at the bank. But fear, I was learning, is not weakness. Fear is information. And I had just been handed a great deal of it. I drove home and started writing down every name I could remember from Thomas's professional life, every thread I had been too trusting to pull before. A former coworker at the pharmacy had once mentioned an attorney named Priya Nair in connection with her own bruising business dispute, calling her the one you want when the other side has more money than you do. That sounded exactly like what I needed. I called Priya's office on a Thursday and had an appointment by the following Monday. Her office sat on the 3rd floor of a converted tobacco warehouse near the river. Priya herself was in her mid-40s, precise in her movements, with the kind of stillness that made you feel every word out of your mouth was being carefully filed away for later. I laid it all out for her in order: the bank meeting, the balance, the transaction history, Blue Water Cargo Partners, Nathaniel Cole. I brought printouts. I brought the lockbox. She listened without interrupting once. When I finished, she sat quietly for a moment, then asked whether Thomas had left a will. He had. I had probated it myself, months earlier. Everything left to me and Caleb in equal shares. The estate, at the time, had been valued at roughly $310,000, the retirement account, the house equity, some personal property. Nothing remotely close to $34 million. Priya's expression didn't shift, but her pen tapped the legal pad once. "This second account was in both your names," she said, "which means, technically, as the surviving holder, that money passed to you automatically at the moment of his death by operation of law. It never would have shown up in the probate estate at all. I hadn't known that. My original estate attorney apparently hadn't thought to ask deeply about accounts we rarely used. The real question, Priya went on, is where that money came from and whether it represents proceeds from something that creates legal exposure for you personally or a claim from a third party. We need to understand exactly what Blue Water Cargo Partners actually did. She recommended a forensic accountant she'd worked with many times, a retired federal financial crimes investigator named Gerald Monroe. I agreed. We set the terms. I wrote the retainer check with hands steadier than I expected them to be. I did not tell Caleb. Not yet. I went back to my ordinary life, the pharmacy counter, the insurance codes, the customers who needed their blood pressure medication explained twice, and I waited. Except ordinary life had picked up a new and unwelcome texture. The sensation of being watched. It started small. A car I didn't recognize, parked twice in 1 week near the end of my street, a maroon sedan, a different spot each time but unmistakably the same car. A phone call from a blocked number that disconnected the moment I answered. And then, 12 days after my first meeting with Priya, a voicemail from a man identifying himself only as an old friend of Thomas's, saying he'd heard I was asking around and would love to take me to lunch sometime soon. I never called back. I told Priya everything in writing with dates and times, exactly as she'd instructed. Gerald Monroe worked faster than I expected. 3 weeks into the engagement, he sat across from me in Priya's conference room and slid a folder across the table. Blue Water Cargo Partners had, for roughly 5 years, served as a vehicle for funneling inflated marine cargo insurance claims from 3 regional shipping and freight brokerages operating out of the ports of Norfolk, Charleston, and Baltimore. It wasn't crude, simple fraud. It was layered. The brokerages had been filing wildly inflated damage and loss claims on shipments, then splitting the inflated portion of the insurance payouts through entities like Blue Water, distributing the proceeds to a small circle of people who provided legitimate-looking cover through consulting agreements. Thomas had been one of those people. Nathaniel Cole had built and run the entire structure. The $34 million wasn't entirely Thomas's. Gerald's best estimate, based on the flow of funds, put Thomas's accumulated share at somewhere around $11 million. The rest had been temporarily parked in our joint account, most likely because Nathaniel needed a quiet holding place while he restructured the distribution network after an internal falling out with one of the brokerages, and Thomas had provided the account without asking too many questions. The 2 withdrawals, $900,000 and $1.4 million, had gone straight to Nathaniel Cole personally through 2 separate accounts in the last year of Thomas's life. Thomas had known. Thomas had participated. And Thomas, in dying, had left me holding an account containing millions that, in Nathaniel Cole's eyes, belonged to Nathaniel Cole, along with more than $20 million more that was entirely and legally mine. I sat in Priya's office and felt the floor tilt beneath me. The man I had loved for 23 years had been living an entire financial life I never once glimpsed. He hadn't told me. He hadn't protected me. He had simply left me holding it. And now Nathaniel Cole was circling. I knew we'd reached the point of no return when Priya said, "Ellie, we need to talk about your options, because whoever left that voicemail already knows you've started asking questions." Priya's advice was direct. We needed to move before Nathaniel did. The money in the account was legally mine by survivorship, but that status could be challenged quickly if Nathaniel, or the federal government, moved first with a civil forfeiture claim or a fraud suit of their own. The window wasn't infinite. Her plan had 2 parts. First, we would voluntarily approach the IRS Criminal Investigation Division through her office, disclosing the account and positioning me as a cooperating witness rather than a target, since voluntary disclosure carries real, documented legal protection when it comes before a formal investigation is opened. Second, we would petition the probate court to reopen Thomas's estate on the grounds that assets had been omitted, which would fold the account into a formal legal process and make any outside claim much harder to execute quietly. It wasn't a perfect plan. Nothing about any of it allowed for perfect. But it was clean, it was legal, and it moved first. Priya filed the paperwork on a Thursday. Gerald prepared a financial summary for the IRS contact. By Friday afternoon, Priya had already spoken with an agent named Marcus Delaney out of the Richmond field office, who received the disclosure without any drama and asked us to sit tight for an initial review. I went home that evening and made dinner, roasted chicken and green beans, the same simple thing I'd made most Fridays for years. I sat at the kitchen table and ate alone and thought, I did something irreversible today. There was grief tangled up in it, because irreversible meant Thomas was no longer someone I could shield from judgment. But there was something else in there too, something I hadn't felt in 9 long months. Agency. I had done something. I had chosen. I slept almost 6 hours that night, the best stretch I'd managed since the bank. The call came the following Saturday morning. The voice on the other end was smooth, warm, and achingly familiar from a decade and a half of holiday dinners and wedding photographs I still had in a box somewhere in the attic. Nathaniel Cole. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. Ellie, just my name, said in a certain tone, the tone of a man who considers his own patience a form of generosity. I think you and I need to talk about what you've been up to this week. He knew. Of course he knew. He had contacts, networks, the kind of reach Thomas used to describe, half admiringly, as a guy who always seems to know things before you do. The real question was how much he knew. I kept my voice level. Nathaniel, I don't think there's anything for us to discuss. A pause. I'm going to say this once as a friend. Whatever you've filed, whoever you've talked to, walk it back. You don't understand the whole picture. Thomas made certain commitments. Those don't just disappear because he's gone. I asked what kind of commitments. The kind, he said, that could make your life very complicated. The kind that gets the IRS looking at you, not just the account. You're sitting on money you didn't earn and by your own account didn't even know about. Or so you claim. How does that look, Ellie? A grieving widow, or a woman who's been quietly living off it for years and is suddenly acting surprised. It was a threat dressed up as concern, the most dangerous kind there is. I told him I had an attorney now and that all future contact needed to go through her. Then I hung up. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time afterward because my hands didn't feel entirely trustworthy. Priya, when I called her, wasn't surprised in the slightest. He's testing what you know and how frightened you are, she said. The fact that he called you directly, instead of routing it through his own lawyer, tells me he doesn't think he has clean legal footing. If he did, his attorneys would be doing the talking. She had me write up the call in detail and send it to her that same night, which I did. 2 days later, Nathaniel's attorney reached out through Priya's office, requesting a collegial meeting to discuss estate matters. Priya declined, politely and firmly. We heard nothing else that week. But the threat had landed somewhere in my chest and stayed there, pulsing quietly under everything else I did. I took 4 days off the following week and drove down to my cousin's place near Virginia Beach. I told her only that I was dealing with complicated estate business and needed rest. I sat on her dock and watched the water and let myself simply be a person for a few days before going back into the fight. I wasn't beaten. I wasn't going to be. But I needed those 4 days first. When I came home, there was a foil-covered dish sitting on my porch with a note that read, "Thinking of you, Rosa." Rosa Delgado had been my next-door neighbor for 8 years, a retired nurse with a booming laugh and an unreasonable number of tomato plants. I stood on my porch holding that dish and thought about how ordinary kindness can undo you completely in the middle of extraordinary stress. I cried a little right there on the steps. Then I went inside, put the dish in the fridge, and checked my email. There was an email from Thomas's sister, Vivian. Vivian Doyle lived in Charleston and had never been a particularly warm presence in my life, cordial in the strictly formal sense, a Christmas card here, a birthday text there, but always with some current underneath I could never quite name. Competition, maybe, or judgment. She'd come to Thomas's funeral, stayed 2 days, and left without offering much beyond a stiff hug at the airport. I hadn't heard a word from her in months. This email was warm, warmer than she had ever been with me, which was the first thing that struck me as strange. She wrote that she'd been thinking about me a great deal, that grief was so isolating, and that she wanted to fly up and take me to dinner to talk about Thomas and about what comes next for you. She said she had some thoughts that might help. I read it 3 times. Then I forwarded it to Priya with a single line. I think this is connected. Advice. She called within the hour. She'd half expected something exactly like this. Nathaniel Cole and Vivian Doyle had known each other for decades, since Nathaniel had been Thomas's closest friend and Vivian was Thomas's sister, and it would be entirely unremarkable for the 2 of them to still be in contact. It would also be entirely characteristic of Nathaniel's approach to send someone I might actually trust, someone with an emotional claim on me, rather than approaching me directly again himself. What does she want? I asked. She wants to know what you know, and what you're planning to do about it, Priya said. And she may be carrying an offer. I wrote Vivian back, thanked her for thinking of me, told her I appreciated it, said I was in the middle of some legal matters tied to Thomas's estate that had my schedule unpredictable for a while, and that I'd reach out when things settled down. Polite, vague, entirely noncommittal. She replied within 20 minutes. Very warm, very understanding. No pressure at all, she said. Take whatever time you need. The speed of that reply told me everything I needed to know. She'd been sitting there waiting for it. I didn't respond again. What I did do, in the weeks that followed, was start finding my footing somewhere outside the legal fight entirely. Priya had suggested, quite practically, that I find a therapist, not for crisis intervention, but for the sustained weight of a long legal process. I found a woman named Dr. Elaine Foster whose office was a short walk from the pharmacy. She was calm, dryly funny, and had worked with clients navigating financial trauma before. Seeing her every other week became a kind of anchor point in my week. I also kept talking to Rosa, though I kept the financial specifics private on Priya's advice. We talked instead about the loneliness of grief, about the strange experience of realizing the person you thought you knew completely had rooms inside him you were never once let into. Rosa, sitting on her porch with iced tea sweating in her hand, said something that stuck with me for a long time afterward. Ellie, the fact that you didn't know doesn't make you a fool. It means he worked very hard to keep you from knowing. That's on him, not you. I had needed to hear exactly that, more than I realized until she said it out loud. Agent Delaney reached out through Priya with a preliminary update. A formal investigation into Blue Water Cargo Partners had officially opened. My status as a cooperating witness was noted and protected. It would be a long process, she said. These things always were. Nathaniel's side went quiet. No more calls. No more emails routed through intermediaries. But I wasn't naive enough to believe he'd simply given up. He was watching, recalculating. Men like Nathaniel Cole do not walk away from $34 million without trying every last door first. I started locking every door in the house, even during the day. I documented everything. I called Priya weekly, and I waited with a steadiness that genuinely surprised me. There's a particular kind of calm that comes not from the absence of danger, but from a decision, clear and settled, that you simply will not be moved. I had made that decision. I was not going to be moved. They came on a Sunday afternoon. I saw the car pull up from my kitchen window, a rented dark SUV, the sort you get straight off an airport lot. Vivian climbed out first in a pressed linen dress, wearing the particular expression she always wore when she was performing warmth. Nathaniel Cole came around from the passenger side. I hadn't laid eyes on Nathaniel in almost 12 years. He was heavier now, gray at the temples, dressed in the deliberately understated way of men who want you to understand that money is not a concern for them. He carried a small gift bag, I watched them walk on my front path, took a slow breath, and opened the door before either of them could knock. "Ellie!" Vivian opened her arms like we were old friends. "You look wonderful." I didn't step back to let them in right away. I stood in my own doorway and said pleasantly, "Vivian, Nathaniel, I wasn't expecting you. You should have called. We were worried about you," Nathaniel said, with a smile that had clearly worked on a great many people over the years. "We're family, Ellie. That doesn't stop just because Thomas is gone." They were not, in fact, my family. But I stepped aside and let them into my living room anyway, because I wanted to know exactly what they'd come to say, and because Priya had told me, if they show up in person, let them talk, document everything, commit to nothing. We sat down. Vivian admired the room in that particular way that really means she's assessing its value. Nathaniel set the little gift bag on my coffee table, a bottle of wine, a small box of chocolates, a performance of normalcy. He spoke first, and I'll give him this, he was skilled. He talked about Thomas, about their friendship going back to their college dorm, about how complicated Thomas's business life had become in his final years, and how he, Nathaniel, had only ever tried to protect him. He wrapped the whole thing in the language of loyalty and family burden and good men caught in difficult circumstances. "The money in that account," he said carefully, "is complicated, Ellie. I think you understand there are parties, and I don't just mean me, who have legitimate claims to portions of it. And the way you're handling this, going through the government, through lawyers, it doesn't protect you. It exposes you. Thomas wouldn't have wanted this." There it was. "Thomas would have wanted you protected," Vivian added, right on cue, her voice going soft. "Whatever mistakes he made, he loved you. And right now, the choices you're making could take everything from you. The house, your reputation, your relationship with Caleb. Is that really what you want?" I looked at her, then at Nathaniel. I thought about 23 years of marriage and an account I'd never once known existed. I thought about a voicemail from a man who wouldn't leave his name. I thought about Vivian's email sent 20 minutes after I'd politely declined her. "Nathaniel," I said, "I want to make sure I understand what you're actually asking me to do. Are you asking me to withdraw my cooperation with a federal investigation?" He shifted in his seat. "I'm asking you to consider a private resolution, something that protects everyone. And if I don't—" His smile didn't disappear exactly, but something behind it went cold. "I'm hoping you'll be reasonable," he said. "Thomas was, until he wasn't, and then things got complicated for him, too." The implications sat in the room like a held breath. Thomas's heart had simply stopped one ordinary night, in his sleep in our own bed. I filed that sentence away in a part of my mind that had gone very quiet and very still. Vivian put her hand on my arm. "Ellie, please. We don't want this to turn adversarial. We want to help you. There's a number," she glanced at Nathaniel, "that we think would be fair, for you personally, something that recognizes your position." They were offering me a slice of money that was already legally mine, in exchange for walking away from my own cooperation and handing them a clear path to the rest of it. I stood up. "I appreciate you both coming by," I said. "I'll let my attorney know you were here. Please direct any further contact to her office." Nathaniel's composure slipped. Not dramatically, he was too controlled for drama, but the pleasant mask around his eyes hardened. He stood slowly. "You're making a mistake, Ellie." "Possibly," I said, "but it's mine to make." They left. I locked the door and stood in my hallway with my back against the wall for a long moment. Was I frightened? Yes. Nathaniel's line about Thomas, until he wasn't, was going to sit in my chest for a long time to come. These weren't simply greedy people. These were people who had lived for years in the space between legal and illegal and had grown entirely comfortable there. But the fear did something I didn't expect. It didn't weaken me. It made everything clearer. I picked up my phone, called Priya, and gave her every single word of what had just happened in my living room. I was done being reasonable with unreasonable people. The deposition took place in April, 7 months after my first visit to Priya's office, in a federal building downtown. Long table, fluorescent lights, the particular hush of a room where things are made official. Present were Agent Delaney, a colleague from IRS-CI, a DOJ attorney named Samuel Reyes, Priya, Gerald Monroe, and me. Nathaniel Cole was deposed separately in a session his attorneys had spent weeks negotiating. I had gone first, 6 weeks earlier. I'd answered every question we'd prepared for, and a few we hadn't. Through all of it, I told the truth, because the truth was the only thing I owned that was entirely clean. When it was over, Samuel Reyes looked across the table at me and said, "Mrs. Doyle, your cooperation has been noted, and it will be reflected in our findings." That was all. But Priya, in the elevator afterward, allowed herself a small, real smile. I held on to that smile for weeks. Today was Nathaniel's turn. I wasn't in the room for it. That wasn't how it worked. But Priya had arranged to be kept informed, and I sat in a coffee shop 2 blocks away with my phone face up on the table and a cup of coffee I barely touched. Morning light slanted low through the window. People around me talked about ordinary Tuesday things. I sat very still and waited. What happened in that room, I learned over the following hours and days in pieces. Nathaniel arrived with 2 attorneys and the confidence of a man who had walked into difficult rooms before and always walked back out fine. For the first round of questions, he held to the framework he'd clearly spent months building: an independent logistics consultant, Blue Water a legitimate advisory partnership, the fees paid for real services rendered, no knowledge whatsoever of any fraudulent activity by the brokerages who'd engaged him. Then the documents came out. Gerald's records, wire transfers, internal emails between Blue Water and the 3 brokerage firms, and a set of text messages recovered from a forensic pull of Thomas's second laptop, the one I'd found once in the trunk of his car and been told, and believed, belonged to a client. The messages were between Thomas and Nathaniel. They were specific. In places, they were almost comically damning, references to the usual split, to moving funds before the underwriter's audit, and to making sure Ellie's name stays on the account so it reads clean. That last phrase was the one that hit hardest when Priya read it to me later, sitting in her car in the parking garage, because neither of us could quite face walking back out into public with that sentence still hanging in the air. Making sure Ellie's name stays on the account so it reads clean. Thomas hadn't put that money in our joint account to share it with me, or to build something for our future together. He'd used my name because it made the account look like an ordinary household savings fund. I had been cover for years, without ever once knowing it. When those messages were placed in front of him, Nathaniel's composure cracked. Not all at once, he was too practiced for that, but steadily. He tried to argue the texts were taken out of context, that Thomas had used loose, imprecise language, that reads clean meant regulatory compliance, not concealment. But Samuel Reyes had come prepared for exactly this line, walking him through each message in careful sequence, asking him to explain the context of every single one, until his own earlier answers began to contradict each other. He claimed no knowledge of Thomas having concerns about the arrangement. There was a message where Nathaniel explicitly reassured him the exposure's manageable. He claimed Blue Water's clients hired him for legitimate advisory work. An email from one of the brokerages referenced Nathaniel's adjustment fee for help with revised claim figures. His attorneys called 2 breaks. Each time Nathaniel came back looking a little less certain, a man whose carefully rehearsed story was being dismantled one document at a time. By early afternoon his voice had tightened, the effort of maintaining control showing through. He built a life on charm and maneuvering room, and neither one meant anything here. The documents didn't care about his tone. By the time the session ended, Nathaniel Cole had contradicted himself on 7 documented points, had been shown evidence directly refuting 4 of his central claims, and had invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination 10 times in the final hour, which, Priya later explained, isn't a legal admission of guilt, but it's certainly a clear acknowledgement that honest answers would be damaging ones. Vivian was interviewed as a material witness. It turned out she'd known about the arrangement for years. Emails showed Nathaniel had kept her informed specifically to secure her help managing Thomas during his final, increasingly anxious months, when Thomas had apparently started talking about wanting out. Vivian's cooperation with Nathaniel, it turned out, had been transactional, not incidental. When those emails were shown to her, I was told she broke down. I didn't know quite what to do with that information, so I filed it away and let it sit. 2 days later, Priya called with a formal finding. I was classified as a non-culpable third party. There was no evidence I had ever knowingly benefited from the scheme. I sat with that news a long while, because being cleared isn't the same as being unheard. It isn't the same as having the husband you thought you had. It isn't the same as 23 years, meaning what you believed they meant. But it was something. It was the truth on the record. And the truth turned out to be precisely what I needed. The indictment came down in June. Nathaniel Cole was charged on 5 counts: wire fraud, conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, money laundering, obstruction of a federal investigation, and structuring financial transactions to evade reporting requirements. His attorneys began negotiating almost immediately, which Samuel Reyes told Priya was a strong sign they understood exactly how the evidence stacked up. There would be no dramatic trial, most likely a plea, with sentencing guidelines Reyes estimated would land somewhere around 7 to 9 years in federal prison, along with a civil forfeiture order requiring Nathaniel to give up assets tied to the scheme. I read the indictment at my kitchen table, all 28 pages of it, a cup of tea going cold beside me. Seeing it laid out in the flat, precise language of federal law felt different than knowing it only in my own head. It was no longer just my fear or my suspicion. It was fact, enumerated, sourced, and signed. Vivian wasn't charged criminally. Her involvement, while knowing, hadn't crossed the line into active participation under the statute. But she was named a relief defendant in the civil proceeding, and the court ordered her to disgorge roughly $260,000 she'd received from Nathaniel over the years, money that had been framed at the time as generous gifts and was now formally established as scheme proceeds. Her attorney filed 2 motions contesting the order. Both were denied. The question of the $34 million was resolved over the following months through a careful process between Priya, the DOJ, and the IRS. Of the full balance, approximately $10.1 million was determined to be directly traceable to fraudulent proceeds, the inflated claims, the laundered cycling of funds through Blue Water, and that portion went to civil forfeiture, applied toward penalties owed by the brokerages and by Nathaniel personally. The remaining balance, approximately $24.5 million, represented Thomas's legitimate consulting income accumulated over the years, plus interest, plus funds that couldn't be traced to fraud with sufficient evidentiary certainty under the law. Given my status as the non-culpable surviving account holder, that portion was mine. $24,580,000. I want to be honest about what I felt when Priya told me the final number. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't the clean, weightless feeling people imagine wealth is supposed to bring. I felt the sheer moral weight of it, the knowledge that this money existed because my husband had participated in something wrong and had chosen, deliberately, never to tell me. There was grief threaded through the relief. There was still anger, though by then it had gone quieter than the sharp thing it had been in those first weeks. And there was the particular exhaustion of a person who has carried a weight for a long time and is only now being allowed to set it down. But I wasn't going to pretend the money wasn't real. And I wasn't going to be careless with it, or guilty about it, or hand it over to people who had no legitimate claim to it at all. I set up a trust with Priya's guidance and a financial advisor named Neil Patterson. We built it conservatively, a portion in treasury instruments, a portion in an index fund, a modest allocation for day-to-day living, and a charitable giving account, which mattered to me deeply. I gave a substantial gift to a free clinic pharmacy fund, the kind of help I'd watched people struggle to afford over 22 years behind the counter. I set money aside for Caleb. The rest I planned to manage slowly, without the kind of sudden decisions grief and a windfall can produce. I left the pharmacy, though not right away. I finished training my replacement and walked out with 22 years of goodwill fully intact. My district manager cried a little at the farewell lunch. I had genuinely loved the work, but I no longer needed it to survive financially, and there were other things I wanted to spend my remaining years doing. Nathaniel Cole pleaded guilty that October to 3 of the 5 counts. The plea agreement recommended 8 years in federal prison and civil forfeiture of assets, totaling roughly $13.2 million. His house outside Charleston was among them, along with 2 rental condos near the Norfolk waterfront and the Range Rover he'd driven to my house that Sunday, a detail Gerald mentioned later with the dry satisfaction of a man who appreciates a complete outcome. Nathaniel would be 62 when he was released, assuming he served the full term. I thought about the man who had once stood in my living room holding a gift bag, telling me Thomas would have wanted me protected. I thought about the line, "Things got complicated for him too," and what he'd meant by it, and what he had believed a sentence like that would do to me. In the end, it did nothing except confirm everything I already understood about who he was. Vivian called me twice after the civil order was entered. I didn't answer either time. Whatever she wanted to say, apology, justification, some plea for understanding, I wasn't in a place to receive it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. That was a decision I decided I got to make entirely on my own timeline, without pressure and without performance. What I felt in the weeks after everything finally resolved wasn't the tidy, cinematic satisfaction you see in stories that end with trumpets. It was quieter than that. It was the particular piece of a person who has finished doing the right thing all the way through. The first thing I did, the very first week after the trust was finalized, was buy a plane ticket to Kyoto. I had wanted to go for years. Thomas had always found a reason to put it off. Too busy, wrong season, maybe next year. I had accepted those reasons the way I'd accepted so many things, quietly, without pressing, without ever asking whether my own wants deserved equal weight in the conversation. There was no one left to negotiate with now, and no reason left to wait. I booked a small apartment near the Philosopher's Path for 3 weeks and went alone, with 1 carry-on bag and a small notebook of hiragana I practiced every morning before I left. I didn't take calls. I walked the temple paths at dawn before the crowds arrived. I sat in tiny restaurants and ordered things I could barely pronounce and ate them slowly, without hurrying. Sitting on a low stone wall beside a quiet canal one evening, I understood that rest isn't emptiness. It's the thing that refills you after you've spent too long pouring yourself out for everyone else. I came home in August and started making changes with the same steadiness I'd brought to the legal fight, methodical, unhurried. I sold the house on Idlewood Court. It had been the right house for the life Thomas and I had shared, and that life was over now. I bought a smaller place a few miles away, closer to the river, quiet enough to actually think. A screen porch, a real garden. I finally tended myself, instead of just admiring from the kitchen window. A small room I turned into a study, painted the exact shade of deep blue Thomas had always talked me out of because it would make the room feel smaller. I painted it myself on a Saturday, windows open, music playing. When I finished, I stood in the doorway and felt something loosen in my chest I hadn't realized was still clenched tight. It was only paint, but it was entirely mine, chosen without a single negotiation. Caleb flew in from Austin that September, and we spent 5 days together, the first real stretch of time we'd shared since his father's funeral. I told him the whole story over 2 long evenings on the back porch. He went quiet for a long time when I finished. He was angry at his father, a clean, sharp anger I recognized completely because I'd felt the exact same thing. I think he was also grieving a second time for a version of his father who had never really existed. I made room for all of it. I didn't try to soften Thomas or explain him away. I just told the truth and let Caleb sit with it, without rushing towards some tidy resolution. By the time he left, something had genuinely shifted between us. We started talking more, not about the case, but about everything else: his job, the woman he'd started seeing, the things he wasn't sure of yet at 29. I had more time now, and I used it. We settled into an easy Sunday phone call that became one of the better parts of my week. We were building something new together, and that felt like one of the few real gifts to come out of an otherwise painful year. I started volunteering at a community center downtown, teaching a basic financial literacy class for people navigating medical debt, the kind of practical help I understood intimately from 2 decades of watching patients choose between prescriptions and rent. It turned out that years of explaining insurance coverage across a pharmacy counter had made me unusually good at breaking complicated systems down into plain language. I went in 3 mornings a week, and it reminded me that purpose doesn't require a crisis to exist. It just requires attention. Rosa and I grew into the kind of real friendship that needs no performance at all. We signed up for a watercolor class together that fall, both of us equally hopeless at it, laughing until we could barely hold our brushes steady, which I've come to believe is one of the necessary nutrients of a livable life. We signed up for the next session without even discussing it. That small, unspoken assumption was its own kind of warmth. Dr. Foster and I kept meeting monthly, though our sessions had shifted somewhere along the way from stress management into something closer to intentional reflection. I was learning things about myself, my patterns, the ways I had quietly made myself smaller over the years to keep a peace that had never been as solid as I believed it was. That work was slow, sometimes uncomfortable, and entirely worth doing. And Nathaniel Cole reported to a federal correctional facility in West Virginia that December. I read the small news item, set my phone face down on the counter, and went out to check on the garden. There was nothing left I needed to feel about him. He had assembled his own consequences, year by year, choice by choice. The system had finally caught up. Vivian, I heard through a mutual acquaintance the following spring, had sold her house in Charleston and moved in with a family member after the forfeiture order. She wasn't doing well by all accounts. The financial strain had compounded other things already going wrong in her life. I didn't feel satisfaction at that, exactly. I felt the flat sadness of waste, of a person who'd had chances to choose differently and hadn't taken them. That was her story to carry now, not mine. What I feel about my own life these days is something I hadn't expected to feel again. I feel like myself, not the woman I was before Thomas, not the woman I became inside the marriage, not the woman I was during that terrible first year of grief. Something further along than all three, a woman forged in a difficulty she never chose, who came out the other side knowing things about herself she'd never had a reason to learn before. Some evenings I walk out to the porch and think, I didn't ask for any of what happened to me, but I am who I am now because of what I chose to do about it. That feels like enough. There are still hard nights, still moments when I reach for the phone to tell Thomas something before I remember I can't. Grief doesn't close up neatly just because the truth came out, but I've stopped waiting for it to. I carry it now, quietly, and keep walking forward into whatever comes next. If you found yourself standing where I stood, $34 million, a husband's secret, and a dangerous man on your doorstep, what would you do? I'd love to know. Leave it in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, you know what to do. Thank you so very much for watching, truly.